In recent times, in many parts of the world, we've seen enormous increases in people's incomes because output has been rising. What's caused the rise in output? Perhaps the most single important thing is increases in investment. More capital equipment in services, in manufacturing, and in lower income societies, agriculture has generated a huge rise in people's well-being. If something causes that level of output and that level of investment to fall, people will suffer. According to a World Development Report, one of the things that can cause investment and potential output to fall is corruption. Before we can think about how corruption might harm investment, we need to be clear about what investment means. Investment is often used in the popular press to mean the purchase of stocks and shares and so on. But to an economist, investment means the purchase of capital items, machinery, buildings and so on, where output is produced. And investment is incredibly important for the well-being of an economy. If something causes us to invest less as a society, if there's less capital equipment, then we're going to produce less output. And if we produce less output, we're going to be worse off because we've got less goods and services. Having thought about what investment means, we're now in a position to think about how an increase in corruption might affect investment, the amount of capital equipment in the economy. Just as one example of the value of investment to a society, this chicken processing plant in Eastern Europe invested in new capital equipment 4 years ago. The result is that output has far more than doubled from the same number of workers, raising national output and national income. It's been so successful that they're now investing in new machinery to produce related products such as sausages and other food products, and hence raise economic well-being. How might corruption discourage investment? Well, in many ways, but we'll mention two. First, bribes to officials act as a tax on profits, discouraging marginal investment. But second, and just as important, as the World Development Report says, bribes are not only a disincentive to further investment because of the immediate costs, but also because they entangle businesses in, quote, a web of time-consuming and economically unproductive relations.
What is going to prevent them from investing in the country is that they don't really know the rules of corruption, because if you're acquainted with the rules, it becomes very easy. You just calculate bribes and corruption into your costs, and if you know who are the people that you're supposed to pay to, life is very easy. But if you don't know that, you're struggling. There's no way to go around it.
I'm in Greece, which is reckoned to be the most corrupt country in the EU. It's reckoned that 500 to 750 million euros changes hands in the form of bribes, involving something of the order of 10% of the population of the country. What those bribes get used for, the main things are doctors, building permits, and perhaps most important of all, to help tax evasion. You give the tax officials some money, and then you pay less tax to the government. Relatively few people in Greece are willing to talk about corruption, but in small cafes, you find no shortage of opinions. Have you had any trouble in the business with the famous Fakeliaki? Have I pronounced that right?
Fakeliaki, yes, I understand what you mean. This is mostly in the tax houses and in the government areas, you know, such like hospitals, such like things. And when you go there, you have to finish something to do your business. You give under the table, this was your name, Fakeliaki. If you have problems with the tax house, Let's say you have to pay 100,000 euros, and you deal with taxmen. And they say, okay, you can pay 10,000 euros and you give me 20,000 to me. It's obviously, you have the benefit, and you do it.
About 10% of citizens pay the so-called fakaliaki little envelopes each year.
It is true that there is an issue of corruption in Greece. It's part of the system, of the business system. It's not a cultural issue, and it doesn't refer only to Greece. For me and for the things that I have seen and I have investigated, it is more a structural issue, which means that the system is developed in that way that most of the times you don't have any other option than to try to find other ways to do your business.
Some time ago, some years ago, it was okay, normal to pay fakalaki, to give money under the table. Now people are afraid, all these people in the government are afraid, and they don't take it that much. Because in the television, you can see your face if you take fakalaki the other day. The people that take the money are afraid of. It is because you go straight to the jail now and they are afraid.
But even countries perceived as relatively free of corruption have some problems.
Does Greece have a problem? Yes, it does. Do the surrounding countries have a problem? Yes, they do. Does the UK have a problem? Yes, they do. But we call it lobbying. We don't call it corruption.
All the evidence suggests that there's corruption in just about all societies, but it varies hugely. In places like Scandinavia, it's clearly very low, but it still exists. But even places like this are of interest to the World Bank, because if we can look at a range of countries where corruption is relatively high, but also where it's relatively low, we can have a much stronger idea of the link between corruption and the level of investment.
Well, I think all kind of corruption is negative for the society. Well, a society that says we have no problem with corruption are truly corrupt. But what's important is to be aware where there are risks and that there are risks for corruption and have a system that's transparent.
We need to look at such countries as well as the more corrupt in order to make comparisons and to see if these countries have relatively high levels of investment. So just how much does corruption affect society's well-being? And in particular, to what extent does it affect the amount of investment in society? The World Bank undertook a regression analysis to try to determine the effect of corruption on investment levels. The results of that analysis are presented in the table. The dependent variable investment is actually investment divided by GDP, gross domestic product. In other words, investment as a proportion of output, although for simplicity we'll now refer to it just as investment. Of the independent variables, the level of corruption is based on surveys of businesses that deal in the 39 countries the World Bank study looked at. The predictability of corruption was found in the same way. Secondary school enrolment is self-explanatory. Initial GDP per capita is the initial output per head at the beginning of the period studied. Policy distortion is a measure of how badly economic policy is conducted. The numbers in the parentheses are the standard errors associated with each of the regression coefficients. So what does all this information tell us? Estimation is by the ordinary least squares method, so the regression won't pick up any relationships that are there that are not linear. Now, first, let's look at the signs for the coefficients. As we've explained, we would have anticipated that corruption harms investment. The greater the corruption, the lower the level of investment, so we would expect the coefficient to have a minus sign. And it does. The next variable is the predictability of corruption, where the coefficient has a positive sign. All other things being equal, the more predictable the corruption, the greater the investment. You may have been surprised by the result we got for the predictability of corruption. But Actually, if you think about it carefully, it becomes fairly clear. Imagine two countries, each with the same level of corruption, but in one country it's more predictable. Then they're more likely to get investment in that country, because one of the things that businessmen hate is uncertainty.
If you have a stable level of corruption at a very high level, I know what I'm playing with. If I have a very stable level of corruption at a very low level, I also know what I'm playing with. We want stability. Why? It gives us predictability.
Corruption practice, or any practice that can be considered as corrupted, it is part of the informal business plan of a multinational or a international company or a small and medium enterprise that operates here.
So if they don't have a problem about the uncertainty with regard to the level of corruption, they're more likely to invest in that economy. Higher levels of secondary school enrolment suggest a better educated workforce, so more attractive to investors. Therefore, we would expect the coefficient to be positive, and it is. Now consider initial GDP per capita. We would expect that if initial output per head is low at the beginning of the period studied, there's more potential for profitable investment, so the minus sign of the coefficient is an expected one. Finally, we would expect that the greater the policy distortion, that is, the worse the economic policy that's being conducted, the less keen investors will be. We would expect a negative coefficient, and it is so. We often learn something about the relationship between the dependent and the independent variables by looking at the magnitude of the coefficients. We can see how much a change in an independent variable affects the dependent variable. But the report doesn't tell us the units of measurement. So here we've only been able to comment on the signs of the coefficients. Now turn to the term R squared. This is often called the coefficient of determination. It tells us the percentage of the variations in the dependent variable that can be explained by variations in the independent variables. Here, 24% of the variations in investment as a proportion of GDP in these 39 countries can be explained by variations in the items that we've mentioned above. Now we need to focus on the numbers in parentheses, the standard errors associated with each of the explanatory variables. These enable us to see how much trust we can put in the size of the coefficients. Let's see how that works for the level of corruption. Step 1 is to produce a t-statistic. We do this by dividing the coefficient by the standard error. So to 2 decimal places, 5.8 divided by 2.2 gives a t-statistic of 2.64. Step 2 is to decide on the level of significance. We'll use 5%. That's not the only possible choice, but it is the most common one. Step 3 is to work out how many degrees of freedom we have. This we find by subtracting the number of independent variables from the number of observations. In our case, with 39 observations, 6 independent variables, so 39 minus 6 equals 33 degrees of freedom. Step 4 is to look up a value in the t-tables. If we look up for the value with 33 degrees of freedom and we want a significance level of 5%, i.e. p equals 0.05, we find a value of 1.69. Step 5 is to compare our computed t-statistic with this value from the table. 2.42 is greater than 1.69. Since our computed value is greater than 1.69, what can we say? We can say that there's only a 5% risk of concluding that the underlying coefficient value is different from 0 when it isn't. If you work through the same steps with each of the other variables, you'll find that both corruption variables are significant at our chosen 5% level, but none of the other variables are. You might also care to check, though, that at a 10% level, the policy distortion variable is significant also. So we do have some evidence that corruption really does have an effect on investment activity. Although the evidence from our study is not very strong, there is a strong a priori case for a link, and there is at least some evidence to support the theory. This suggests that attempts to control corruption are important in all societies.
Corruption exists in the EU and in the United States and in the UK, but it's on a high level, and ordinary people don't notice it. They don't know about it. It happens on a very high governmental level.
I can go into many developed economy perspectives where, again, I use the term lobbying. Okay, I'm pushing things. Is it corruption to give somebody money in order to influence decisions, for example, in the medical profession? Well, no, it's just a pressure group. It's a lobby group. Okay, so, and you'll see the big differences in wages. At the end of the day, is it just is it something in sheep's clothing? Okay, you're looking at the same thing, just in another type of context.
The Council of Europe has declared corruption a key political issue in Europe, and the European Union has tried, not always successfully, to insist on corruption control as a condition of membership for potential new entrants. Regression analysis can do many things, but just one of them is to point up the need for such controls.